The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as United Flight 847 lurched through 30,000 feet of turbulence. Most passengers gripped their armrests, praying to whatever gods they believed in. But in seat 22B, Captain Vera Ghost Kozlova slept like the dead, her weathered hands folded across a dog-eared copy of Dostoevsky. The Ambien had finally kicked in after 18 months of sleepless nights, 18 months since Kandahar, 18 months since she'd last touched the controls of anything more sophisticated than a rental car. The first indication something was catastrophically wrong came at 3:47 hours, when the aircraft's nose dipped 15 degrees and stayed there. Oxygen masks deployed like yellow flowers blooming in the cabin's artificial dawn. Passengers screamed. Children cried. But Ghost remained motionless, her breathing steady, her face peaceful for the first time in over a year. 3 rows behind her, Navy SEAL Captain Marcus Reaper Blackwood unbuckled his seatbelt with practiced efficiency. His team was scattered throughout the cabin, 6 operators returning from a classified mission in Romania, all of them carrying the weight of things they could never speak about. Blackwood moved forward through the chaos, his eyes scanning faces, reading fear like a tactical assessment. The intercom crackled to life with the kind of desperation that cuts through panic like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a serious mechanical emergency. Both pilots are incapacitated, and we need anyone with flight experience to identify themselves immediately." Blackwood reached the cockpit door just as a flight attendant emerged, her face pale as porcelain. Blood stained her pristine uniform. Through the gap, he glimpsed the horror inside. Both pilots slumped over their controls, victims of what appeared to be severe food poisoning or something far worse. The aircraft shuddered again, losing another 500 feet of altitude. 237 souls aboard, fuel for maybe another hour. And somewhere below them, the Atlantic Ocean waited with infinite patience. Blackwood's voice cut through the screaming like a command blade. "Who can fly this bird?" Silence stretched like a held breath. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the cabin, a flight attendant's voice trembled. "There's a woman in 22B military patches on her bag. She hasn't moved since takeoff." All eyes turned toward the sleeping figure. Vera Kozlova, call sign Ghost, the woman who'd earned her nickname by disappearing entire Taliban convoys in the Afghan mountains. The pilot who'd flown more combat missions than most people had hot meals. The ghost who'd been grounded not by enemy fire or mechanical failure, but by her own demons and a medical board that didn't understand the difference between post-traumatic stress and cowardice. Now 30,000 feet above the dark Atlantic, with death climbing toward them from below, someone would have to wake the ghost. The Boeing 777's engines screamed their mechanical distress as Captain Blackwood made his way down the aisle, each step measured and deliberate despite the aircraft's sickening descent. Around him, passengers pressed themselves into their seats like they could somehow meld with the fabric and disappear. The smell of fierce sweat mingled with recycled cabin air and something else, something that reminded him of burning oil and electrical fires. He reached row 22 and stopped. The woman in 22B looked smaller than he'd expected, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that had gone slightly askew during sleep. Her civilian clothes couldn't hide the military bearing, the way she maintained perfect posture even unconscious. On the floor beside her feet, a battered leather flight bag bore the telltale signs of deployment after deployment, dust that could only come from Afghan airstrips, scratches from hasty loading under fire. Blackwood knelt beside her seat, nodding the Cyrillic text on her book's cover, the small scar above her left eyebrow that spoke of close calls and hard landings. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. No response. The Ambien held her in its chemical embrace while gravity pulled the aircraft toward the sea. Behind him, his team had spread throughout the cabin, their training kicking in automatically. Sergeant Willis was organizing the flight attendants, establishing a makeshift command structure. Corporal Davies had taken position near the emergency exits, his eyes scanning for potential threats or complications. But they all knew the truth. In this particular battlefield, their skills were useless. Blackwood increased his volume. "Captain, we need you." Still nothing. He glanced at the nearest flight attendant, a young woman whose name tag read Jennifer and whose hands shook like autumn leaves. "How long has she been out?" "Since boarding in London," Jennifer whispered. "She asked for water and took some pills, said she hadn't slept in months." The aircraft lurched again, and somewhere in first class, someone started praying in Spanish. The words echoed off the curved cabin walls like incantations against the inevitable. Outside the windows, stars wheeled slowly as the 777's autopilot struggled to maintain heading while losing altitude at an alarming rate. Blackwood made a decision that would haunt him for years afterward. He reached into his tactical vest and withdrew a small ampule, military-grade stimulant, the kind special operations used when staying awake meant staying alive. Breaking it open, he waved it under Ghost's nose. The reaction was immediate and violent. Vera Kozlova's eyes snapped open, her hand moving to where her sidearm would have been if she were in uniform. Her gaze found Blackwood's face, noted his SEAL insignia, cataloged the tactical vest, and the barely controlled chaos around them. In less than 3 seconds, she'd assessed the situation with the cold precision of someone trained to make life-or-death decisions in milliseconds. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight Russian accent that spoke of childhood in St. Petersburg and training in places most people couldn't find on a map. The intercom crackled with increasing desperation as Vera Ghost Kozlova pulled herself fully awake, her mind shifting from chemical fog to crystal clarity with practiced efficiency. Captain Blackwood watched her transformation with professional appreciation. This was how operators looked when they switched on, when years of training overrode fear and fatigue and human limitation. "Both pilots are down," he said without preamble. "Looks like food poisoning may be worse. We've got maybe 45 minutes of fuel and we're losing altitude. The autopilot's trying to compensate, but—" Ghost was already moving, unbuckling her seatbelt with steady hands. "Flight attendant training on this bird." Jennifer stepped forward, her composure returning slightly in the presence of someone who radiated competence. "Basic emergency procedures. I know where everything is, but I've never—" "You don't need to fly it," Ghost interrupted, standing and shouldering her flight bag. "You just need to follow orders." She looked at Blackwood. "Your people know anything about aviation. We can follow instructions and keep our mouths shut." For the first time since waking, Ghost almost smiled. "That puts you ahead of most pilots I've worked with." She moved toward the cockpit, noting how passengers tracked her movement with desperate hope. The weight of their expectations settled on her shoulders like a familiar burden, different from the weight of ordnance and armor, but just as heavy. The cockpit door stood open, revealing the nightmare within. Both pilots had succumbed to whatever had poisoned them, their faces gray and slack. Warning lights painted the instrument panels in angry reds and ambers. The Boeing 777's glass cockpit displayed a chaos of alerts and cautions that would have overwhelmed a lesser pilot. But Ghost wasn't a lesser pilot. She'd cut her teeth on Soviet-era fighters that would try to kill you if you looked at them wrong, then transitioned to American aircraft that demanded precision and finesse. She'd flown everything from ancient Mi-8 helicopters to state-of-the-art FA-18s, and she'd never lost a bird to anything but politics. She slid into the captain's seat, her hands finding controls with muscle memory that bypassed conscious thought. The Boeing systems responded to her touch like a familiar lover, displays reorganizing themselves as she began the delicate process of assessment. Fuel state, critical. Altitude, 26,000 feet and descending. Engine status, nominal but stressed. Hydraulics, compromised but functional. "Jennifer," she called without turning around. I need you to get on the PA and tell everyone to prepare for emergency landing procedures. Captain Blackwood, your team needs to help the flight attendants secure the cabin, and someone get these two out of here." As Blackwood's SEALs began moving the incapacitated pilots, Ghost's fingers danced across the flight management system, inputting commands that would turn them toward the nearest suitable airport. The mathematics of survival played out in her mind: fuel consumption versus distance, descent rate versus runway length, wind patterns and weather conditions, all factoring into an equation where the answer meant life or death for 237 souls. Below them, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, dark and patient and utterly unforgiving. The Boeing 777 systems sang their electronic warnings as Ghost's hands moved across controls she hadn't touched in over a year. Muscle memory fought against conscious thought, training battled trauma, and somewhere between the two, she found the calm center that had kept her alive through 17 combat deployments and more close calls than any pilot should survive. "Gander Control, this is United 847 declaring emergency," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Both pilots incapacitated, passenger pilot assuming controls. Request immediate vector to nearest suitable airport and emergency services standing by." The response crackled through her headset almost immediately. "United 847, Gander Control copies emergency. Vector heading 090, descend and maintain flight level 200. Advise souls on board and fuel remaining." 237 souls, fuel approximately 30 minutes, Ghost replied, her eyes scanning the instrument panel while her hands made minute adjustments to keep the aircraft stable. Behind her, she could hear Blackwood organizing his team with military efficiency, their voices calm and authoritative as they helped secure the cabin. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. St. John's, Newfoundland was their best option, a major airport with long runways and excellent emergency facilities. But the distance required precision flying that left no margin for error. Every degree off course, every unnecessary maneuver, every moment of hesitation could mean the difference between landing and becoming another statistic in aviation history. Ghost's fingers found the trim controls, adjusting the aircraft's balance with the delicate touch of someone who'd learned to coax performance from machines that should have been graveyard-bound years ago. The 777 responded like a thoroughbred, its engines settling into a rhythm that spoke of reliability and power held in careful reserve. "How you doing up there, Captain?" Blackwood's voice carried genuine concern mixed with professional respect. He'd taken position directly behind the pilot's seats, his presence both reassuring and unobtrusive. "Been better," Ghost replied without taking her eyes off the instruments. "Been worse, too. Your boys know how to keep passengers calm. They're good at following orders and projecting confidence. That usually works." Through the cockpit windows, the first hints of dawn painted the eastern horizon in shades of amber and gold. Below them, icebergs drifted like sleeping giants in the North Atlantic, their bulk hidden beneath waters that had claimed ships and aircraft for centuries. The beauty of it was breathtaking and terrible, nature's indifference to human ambition and mortality. United 847, contact St. John's approach on 119.7. They're rolling emergency equipment and clearing all traffic. You'll have priority handling. Ghost switched frequencies, her movements automatic and precise. "St. John's approach, United 847 with you, flight level 180, inbound emergency." United 847, St. John's approach, runway 08 is active, winds 070 at 15, visibility unlimited. Emergency equipment is standing by. Please advise pilot qualifications and aircraft familiarity. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Ghost's throat tightened with memories of review boards and medical evaluations, of men in suits who'd never pulled GS or felt the kiss of tracer fire explaining why she was no longer fit for duty. Behind her, she sensed Blackwood waiting for her answer, felt the weight of 236 other lives hanging on her response. The radio crackled with static, amplifying her silence into something that felt like judgment. Below them, the Atlantic rolled on, patient and eternal, while above them the stars began to fade into memory. The question of qualifications hung in the cockpit air like smoke from an old fire. Ghost's hands tightened imperceptibly on the controls as 18 months of doubt and second-guessing collided with the immediate reality of an aircraft full of people who needed her to be exactly who she'd always been, regardless of what some medical board had decided about her fitness for duty. St. John's Approach Aircraft Commander has approximately 8,000 flight hours, multi-engine commercial and military, current on Boeing systems, she transmitted, her voice betraying nothing of the internal struggle. Technically true if she ignored the 18-month gap and the fact that her last official flight had ended with her grounded indefinitely. Copy that 847. Descend and maintain 10,000. Reduce speed to 250 knots. Be advised, we have search and rescue assets airborne and medical teams standing by. Blackwood leaned forward slightly, close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of tactical gear and deployment stress. "You good, Captain?" His voice carried no judgment, only professional concern from one operator to another. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied, adjusting power settings with the precision of a surgeon. The Boeing responded beautifully, its descent rate smoothing into something that spoke of controlled flight rather than barely managed emergency. Through the cockpit windscreen, the coastline of Newfoundland materialized out of the morning haze like a promise kept. Rocky cliffs gave way to more forgiving terrain, and somewhere ahead lay St. John's International Airport with its long runways and emergency crews who dealt with transatlantic diversions before. The fuel quantity indicator painted its numbers in increasingly urgent shades of amber. 22 minutes remaining, maybe 25 if she played the engines perfectly. The approach would require single-attempt precision, no go-arounds, no second chances, no room for the kind of perfectionism that had once made her the best pilot in her squadron. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Kozlova speaking from the flight deck." Her voice carried throughout the cabin with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "We are beginning our approach to St. John's, Newfoundland. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for emergency landing procedures. Everyone else, please review your safety cards and follow all crew instructions. We're going to get through this together." Behind her, she heard Blackwood's team moving through the cabin with quiet efficiency, their presence calming passengers who responded instinctively to the confidence of trained operators. Jennifer and the other flight attendants moved with purpose, checking seat belts and emergency equipment with renewed determination. The aircraft shuddered slightly as Ghost extended the landing gear, the mechanical thunk reverberating through the airframe like a heartbeat. Hydraulic systems strained but held, giving her the control authority she'd need for the approach. On the instrument panel, lights shifted from red to green in a sequence that spoke of systems working as designed despite the extraordinary circumstances. United 847, contact tower on 118.1. You're cleared for the ILS approach runway 08. Emergency equipment is in position. She switched frequencies one final time, her movements automatic despite the complexity of flying an unfamiliar aircraft in an emergency situation. The tower controller's voice carried the professional calm of someone who'd guided aircraft through countless emergencies. 847 Tower. Winds 060 at 12, runway 08 cleared to land. We're standing by. Ahead of them, St. John's International Airport spread across the landscape like salvation made manifest in concrete and steel. The instrument landing system guided them down through the final approach like invisible hands reaching up from the earth. Ghost's eyes moved in constant patterns across the flight instruments: airspeed, altitude, heading, sync rate. each parameter held within the narrow margins that separated successful landing from catastrophe. The Boeing 777 responded to her inputs with the reliability of German engineering married to American innovation, its fly-by-wire systems interpreting her intentions and translating them into precise control movements. 500 feet, she announced, following procedures burned into her memory through thousands of hours and hundreds of landings. But this wasn't just another approach. This was the moment 18 months of doubt and medical review boards either vindicated themselves or proved themselves wrong. Below them, St. John's International stretched its welcoming arms in the form of runway lights and emergency vehicles. Fire trucks stood at attention like mechanical soldiers, their crews ready for whatever might come. Ambulances waited in formation, medical personnel prepared for casualties that might or might not materialize depending on the next 3 minutes of flight. 400 feet on glide path, Ghost called out, her voice carrying to the passenger cabin where 236 people held their breath and probably their makers' names. Blackwood remained behind her like a silent guardian, his presence both comforting and unnecessary. This was her domain, her expertise, her moment to prove that grounding orders and psychological evaluations couldn't erase 2 decades of flight experience. The runway threshold approached with mathematical precision. Ghost's right hand held the throttles, ready to add power if the approach went unstable, while her left hand guided the control wheel with microscopic adjustments that kept them centered on the localizer. The Boeing's engines sang their mechanical song, perfectly balanced between lift and gravity, thrust and drag. 100 feet, she announced. The main landing gear stretched toward the runway like fingers reaching for safety. In the passenger cabin, flight attendants called out final instructions. Heads down, stay down. The words echoed through the aircraft like a prayer in multiple languages: English, French, Spanish, and what sounded like Mandarin from somewhere in business class. 50 feet. The runway rushed up to meet them with the inevitability of physics and the uncertainty of human skill. Ghost's hands moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this before, many times, under conditions far worse than mechanical emergencies and passenger aircraft. 30 feet, 10. The main landing gear kissed the runway with the gentlest of touches, followed immediately by the nose gear settling onto concrete with barely a bump. Ghost immediately pulled the throttles to idle and deployed the speed brakes, feeling the Boeing's weight transfer to its wheels as aerodynamic lift bled away into memory. United 847, welcome to St. John's, the tower controller said, and his voice carried genuine relief mixed with professional pride. Turn left at taxiway Alpha 5. Emergency equipment will escort you to the gate. Behind her, Ghost heard something she hadn't heard in 18 months, the sound of applause. It started tentatively, maybe from one of Blackwood's SEALs, then spread throughout the cabin like wildfire until 236 people were clapping and crying and laughing with the desperate relief of those who'd stared death in the face and lived to remember it. She keyed her microphone one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Newfoundland. The Boeing 777 rolled to a stop at Gate 12, with the mechanical precision of a mission completed successfully. Outside the cockpit windows, emergency vehicles maintained their vigilant positions, while ground crews prepared for the complex dance of passenger disembarkation and medical evaluation. Ghost's hands remained on the controls for several moments longer than necessary, her mind still processing the transition from airborne emergency to ground-based safety. Behind her, Captain Blackwood finally allowed himself to exhale fully. "Outstanding flying, Captain," he said, his voice carrying the professional respect of one warrior acknowledging another's skill. Textbook approach under impossible circumstances. Ghost powered down the engines with methodical precision, following shutdown checklists from memory, while the reality of what had just occurred began to settle in. She'd successfully landed a Boeing 777 with 237 souls aboard after an 18-month forced hiatus from flying. More importantly, she'd done it without hesitation, without the crippling self-doubt that had plagued her dreams since Kandahar. United 847, Ground Control. Medical personnel are boarding through the forward door for pilot evaluation. Please remain on flight deck until cleared by emergency services. Copy, Ground Control, Ghost replied, then turned to address the passengers who were already beginning to move about the cabin despite instructions to remain seated. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats until medical personnel have cleared the aircraft. The emergency is over, but we need to ensure everyone is healthy before disembarkation. Blackwood SEALs move through the cabin with practiced efficiency, helping maintain order while projecting the calm confidence that comes from years of dealing with high-stress situations. Passengers looked at them with gratitude that went beyond words. These men and the woman in the cockpit had pulled them back from the edge of disaster. Jennifer appeared in the cockpit doorway, her uniform still immaculate despite everything they'd been through. Captain Kozlova, I wanted to thank you personally. I've been flying for 12 years and I've never seen anything like that approach. It was perfect. Ghost finally allowed herself a small smile. Just doing the job, Jennifer. You and your crew performed exceptionally well under pressure. Through the cockpit windows, she could see media vehicles beginning to arrive at the airport perimeter. Word of the emergency had clearly spread, and within hours, the story would be international news. The thought made her stomach tighten. She'd spent 18 months avoiding attention, avoiding questions about Kandahar and the medical board's decision to ground her. Captain, Blackwood said quietly, you mind if I ask about your call sign? Ghost isn't exactly standard military nomenclature. Ghost's expression grew distant, her eyes focusing on something beyond the airport's control tower. Afghanistan, fourth tour. Taliban had been hitting supply convoys on the Kandahar-Kabul highway, always knew exactly when and where to strike. Command thought there was a leak, maybe someone feeding them intelligence. She paused, her fingers unconsciously tracing the small scar above her left eyebrow. Turned out they had spotters on ridgelines, calling in every convoy that moved. So we started flying cover missions, low and fast, staying below radar. I'd come out of nowhere, hit their positions and disappear before they could react. Hence Ghost, Blackwood observed. Hence Ghost. The Taliban started calling the highway the road where spirits hunt, made them nervous enough that convoy attacks dropped by 60%. Her voice carried pride mixed with something darker. Until the last mission. She didn't elaborate, and Blackwood had enough operational experience to recognize when someone had reached the boundary of what they were willing to share. Some stories belonged to their tellers alone, carried like scars that never fully healed. Medical personnel had boarded the aircraft and were beginning their evaluation of passengers and crew. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Newfoundland, painting the airport in shades of gold and possibility. Ghost began gathering her few belongings, preparing to face whatever came next. The emergency was over, but in many ways her real challenge was just beginning. The debriefing room at St. John's International Airport felt sterile and impersonal, fluorescent lights casting everything in harsh white that made shadows seem deeper by contrast. Ghost sat across from a collection of officials who'd assembled with remarkable speed. Transport Canada investigators, airline representatives, union officials, and a federal air marshal who'd introduced himself with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Captain Blackwood had been dismissed after giving his statement, but not before shaking her hand with the firm grip of mutual respect. If you ever decide to get back in the game, he'd said quietly, the teams could use someone with your skills. She'd thanked him without committing to anything beyond politeness. Now she faced questions that felt more like accusations wrapped in bureaucratic language. The lead investigator, a thin man named Davidson, whose tie was knotted with mathematical precision, consulted his tablet with the air of someone conducting an inquisition rather than a routine interview. "Captain Kozlova," he began, his voice carrying the nasal quality of someone unaccustomed to making decisions under pressure. "While we appreciate your intervention in this emergency, we need to understand your current flight status. Our records show you've been on administrative leave for 18 months. Ghost met his gaze without flinching. "My licenses are current, my medical is valid, and I successfully landed a Boeing 777 with 237 souls aboard. I'm not sure what else is relevant to this discussion." Davidson's eyebrows lifted slightly at her directness. "The circumstances of your administrative leave are quite relevant, Captain. The psychological evaluation following your last military deployment raised questions about your fitness for duty." The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft operations. Ghost felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation that had plagued her since Kandahar. Not fear exactly, but something closer to rage at being constantly required to justify her competence to people who'd never faced a fraction of the challenges she'd overcome. "The psychological evaluation," she said carefully, "was conducted by people who'd never been deployed, never been in combat, and never had to make life-or-death decisions while being shot at. They decided I had adjustment difficulties, because I couldn't sleep after watching a cargo plane full of wounded soldiers get shot down on my final mission." She leaned forward slightly, her voice gaining intensity. "Today, those same adjustment difficulties helped me save 237 lives. Maybe the problem isn't with my psychology. Maybe it's with people who think that caring about the lives under your responsibility is somehow a disqualifying factor." The airline representative, a woman named Patricia Summers who'd been silent until now, spoke up. "Captain Kozlova, I think what Mr. Davidson is trying to understand is whether today's events represent a return to flight status or simply an emergency intervention." Ghost considered the question carefully. For 18 months, she'd been content to avoid flying, to work as a flight instructor for wealthy hobbyists who wanted to add multi-engine ratings to their licenses. She'd convinced herself that the dreams would fade, that the weight of responsibility would eventually lift from her shoulders. But today had reminded her of something she'd forgotten. She was born to fly, and grounding her was like asking a bird to forget it had wings. "I want my flight status restored," she said simply. "Full commercial privileges, no restrictions." Today proved that whatever psychological concerns the review board had were unfounded. Davidson consulted his tablet again, his fingers dancing across the screen with bureaucratic precision. "That's not a decision we can make here, Captain. You'll need to undergo re-evaluation, additional training, psychological assessment." "No," Ghost interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded aircraft worth millions of dollars and crews who'd trusted her with their lives. "Today is my re-evaluation. The passengers on United 847 are my character witnesses. The successful landing is my skills assessment." Outside the window, she could see news crews setting up for what would undoubtedly be extensive coverage of the day's events. The story was already spinning beyond her control, becoming something larger than the simple act of bringing an aircraft safely to the ground. She wondered if Blackwood and his team were already on their way to wherever their next mission would take them, carrying their secrets and their scars with them. The medical examiner's report on the incapacitated pilots had been preliminary but conclusive. Severe food poisoning from contaminated meals served in the crew lounge at Heathrow. Both men were expected to recover fully, but their illness had created a situation where only Ghost's presence had prevented a catastrophe of enormous proportions. Dr. Sarah Chen, the chief medical officer who'd examined the affected pilots, entered the debriefing room with a tablet full of test results and the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering complex information under pressure. She nodded to the assembled officials before taking a seat across from Ghost. "The preliminary toxicology results are quite clear," Dr. Chen announced, consulting her tablet. "Both pilots consumed contaminated seafood approximately 6 hours before onset of symptoms. The bacterial load was sufficient to cause rapid incapacitation in healthy adults. They're stable now, but they would have been completely unable to control the aircraft." Davidson leaned forward with the intensity of someone sensing an opportunity to shift blame away from bureaucratic decisions. "So this was purely a medical emergency, nothing to do with maintenance issues or crew fatigue." "Correct. Without Captain Kozlova's intervention, we would be looking at a very different outcome." Ghost felt a familiar mixture of vindication and exhaustion. She'd spent 18 months being told she was unfit for duty, psychologically damaged, a liability to flight safety. Now these same people were beginning to understand that her experience and training had prevented a disaster that would have dominated headlines for months. "Dr. Chen," she said, "I'd like you to forward your medical assessment to the Federal Aviation Medical Office. I think they'll find it interesting reading alongside my psychological evaluation from 18 months ago." Patricia Summers cleared her throat diplomatically. "Captain, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. There are procedures to follow, protocols to observe. Today's events were extraordinary, but they don't automatically supersede existing administrative decisions." Ghost stood abruptly, her patience finally exhausted. "Ms. Summers, I've followed procedures my entire career. I followed procedures when I flew combat missions over Afghanistan. I followed procedures when I brought damaged aircraft home with wounded crew members. I followed procedures when I submitted to psychological evaluation after watching good people die." She moved toward the window, looking out at the Boeing 777 that sat at Gate 12 like a monument to successful emergency response. Ground crews were still working around it, documenting every system, every component, every detail that would eventually become part of the official investigation. "Today, I stopped following procedures and started saving lives. If that makes me unfit for duty in your eyes, then perhaps the problem isn't with my fitness. Perhaps the problem is with a system that values paperwork more than passengers." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Davidson's tablet had gone idle, Patricia Summers was staring at her hands, and Dr. Chen was looking at Ghost with something that might have been professional admiration. "Captain Kozlova," Davidson said finally, his voice lacking its earlier bureaucratic confidence, "what would you like to see happen next?" Ghost turned back to face them, her expression calm and determined. "I want to return to the cockpit, not as an emergency measure, not as a one-time exception, but as a fully qualified commercial pilot. I want to fly the routes, carry the passengers, and take the responsibility that I was trained for." She paused, letting her words settle over the room like dust after an explosion. "And I want the people who grounded me to explain how their psychological assessment squares with today's performance. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like they confused competence with trauma and mistook dedication for dysfunction." Outside, the afternoon sun painted the airport in golden hues that reminded her of sunrise over the Hindu Kush, of morning patrols when the mountains looked like sleeping giants, and the sky stretched endless and full of possibility. She'd been grounded long enough. It was time to reclaim the sky. The news conference 3 hours later felt like theater to Ghost, but she understood the necessity of public relations in an industry where confidence meant everything and perception often mattered more than reality. The airport's media room buzzed with reporters from across North America and beyond, their cameras and recording equipment creating a forest of technology focused on the small podium, where she would be expected to explain how she'd managed to do what she'd been trained for her entire adult life. Patricia Summers introduced her with the kind of corporate enthusiasm that felt manufactured, but served its purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, we're pleased to introduce Captain Vera Kozlova, whose quick thinking and exceptional skill prevented what could have been a catastrophic accident today. Ghost approached the microphone with the same calm precision she'd used to approach runway 86 hours earlier. The room fell silent except for the mechanical clicking of camera shutters and the soft hum of recording equipment. She looked out at faces that represented newspapers, television networks, and digital media outlets that would carry her story around the world within hours. "My name is Captain Vera Kozlova," she began, her slight Russian accent lending gravity to words she'd never expected to speak in public. "Until today, I had been on administrative leave from commercial flying following a medical review board's decision 18 months ago. Today reminded me why I became a pilot and why grounding experienced aviators based on psychological speculation rather than demonstrated performance is a mistake our industry can't afford to make." The questions came immediately, a barrage of inquiries about her military background, her commercial experience, the specifics of today's emergency. She answered with the directness of someone accustomed to briefings where clarity meant survival, but she could see the reporters crafting narratives that would fit their predetermined storylines. "Captain Kozlova," called out a reporter from CNN, "can you tell us about your military service and how it prepared you for today's emergency?" "I flew combat missions in Afghanistan for 4 tours, primarily close air support and convoy protection. The military teaches you to make decisions quickly with incomplete information while people are shooting at you. Today was challenging, but nobody was shooting at us." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room, but Ghost's expression remained serious. The real heroes today were the flight attendants and passengers who followed instructions without panic, and the SEAL team that helped maintain order in the cabin. "I just did what any qualified pilot would do. I flew the airplane." "What about the circumstances of your administrative leave?" This from a reporter whose tone suggested he'd already researched her background and found the controversy he was hopping for. Ghost met his gaze steadily. "I was grounded because a psychological review board decided that my reaction to losing fellow service members in combat indicated adjustment difficulties that might impact my flying ability. Today, 237 people might disagree with that assessment." The room stirred with the energy of reporters sensing a larger story about military veterans, mental health, and bureaucratic decision-making. Ghost could see the headlines forming. "Grounded War Hero Saves 237 Lives. PTSD Pilot's Heroic Return. Military Trauma versus Flight Safety." But those headlines missed the point entirely. This wasn't about trauma or heroism or dramatic redemption narratives. This was about competence, about the difference between psychological theory and practical ability, about an industry that had forgotten the difference between being damaged and being dangerous. "Captain," called out a reporter from the local St. John's paper,